The next session is about knowledge exchange for landscape decisions, and I would just like to invite the first speaker, Sikai Cho from the University of Exeter, to come to the front and talk about mapping the spatial temporal dynamic of greenhouse gas removals using Jules RED. Over to you.
There are lots of seats towards the front of the room if anybody's looking for a seat.
Hi everyone, good morning. I'm Sikai Cho from University of Exeter, and my topic is mapping the spatial temporal dynamic of greenhouse gases removal using a land surface model called Jules RED. And my working partner are Argus, Anna Harper, and Peter Cox, also from University of Exeter. So the importance of the greenhouse gases removal, because global greenhouse gases is a main contributor to global warming, and it is mentioned by like Paris Agreement and HM government, the importance and the target, how much we should remove greenhouse gases to reduce the global temperature. And the figure shows our project. The project involves a bunch of tests from measuring greenhouse gases removal, how the land use change will impact the work of greenhouse gases removal. And from our working package, we try to use the model to identify how much greenhouse gases could we remove by planting trees. The target set by DFERA is planting 30,000 hectares of new woodland every year by 2025. And the potential for carbon removals may be 10 to 22 million CO2, which contains a high proportion in all of the greenhouse gases emission. And the issue we concern is where should we plant the trees, what trees should we plant, and what kind of land use is replaced by the tree planting. And this is the model we used in our research, the Joint UK Land Environment Simulator. This is a model developed by UK Met Office, originally as a community land service model, which is be coupled to a global circulation model. It could simulate the fluxes, included heat, water fluxes, and carbon fluxes between the land and the near-surface atmosphere. It can simulate all the physical process that controls carbon uptake and storage on land. And it also predicts hydrology and other energy exchanges within the atmosphere. It is suitable to be used to predict theoretically any kind of the tree species to be planted on the location we wanted based on its given physical conditions. And based on Jules, we have an alternative version called Jules RED, which is important because this alternative model can capture the important changes in forest demography. For example, which was shown in the figure, there are 15 forest classes. From 1 to 15 is you can imagine it's from smaller tree to larger tree. So when the tree grows, the diameter of trunk will increase. So it may be converted to class 1 to class 2 and more. So this model helps to capture this process, which is not included in the traditional vegetation models. And the growth curve of a species called Sika spruce was calibrated in a plantation site in Howard Forest, which is the forest type shown in the right figure. This is also the species we used to simulate it in this study. And we set the climate change condition in the pattern in RCP 2.6, which is a very straight pathway CO2 emission as the prediction now. The summer temperature will increase by 1 to 2 Celsius degree warmer, and the winter temperature will increase 0.9 to 2.1 degree in the UK, as shown in the figure. And these data are simulated by Chesscape. So our project is mapping the spatial temporal dynamic of greenhouse gases using GeoThread. We aim to map out the carbon accumulation in 2014, 2060, and 2080 within the UK. The forests are scheduled to be planted in the start of 2024, which is next year. And the density is 2,500 hectares per hectare density. And we selected 100 points in this initial study based on the soil property, geographic, and climate classification. So we have do some correlation analysis on the input data and the vegetation carbon, which is our simulated result. And it shows that rainfall and the minimum winter temperature has the higher impact on the vegetation carbon accumulation. So this is the temporal dynamic of the greenhouse gases removal. You can see that from 2040, 2060 to 2080, the pattern of the carbon accumulation is a bit different. And in 2080, which is our final year, the range is between 13 to 17, which is around 29% difference. So this figure shows the carbon accumulation in 2 single sites, which is the maximum carbon accumulation site and the minimum carbon accumulation site. So in this figure, you can clearly see how much carbon is accumulated in every time step you wish to know. So this is the special dynamic of the greenhouse gases removal across the UK. You can see that the red point shows the highest efficiency of vegetation carbon accumulation, which is only a few points over 17 kilograms per meter. Some points are located in Wales and also one point in northern England. And the blue points are the most common ranges of carbon removal, which could be seen across Scotland and the UK. Green points and pink points are least efficiency points, which is more seen in North Scotland. But you can see that in North Scotland, there are also some points marked as blue. So how to identify the factors like rainfall and temperature we mentioned before is the task we are continuing working on. So a quick summary of our today's presentation. The case study where government is considering is how to incentive tree planting and to optimal land use for multiple purposes. We here identify rainfall and temperature to be the most efficient factors determining the carbon accumulation. And we demonstrate the capability and effectiveness of the greenhouse gases removal using GeoSTRAT model, which we think it could be a relevant reference for land use change management strategy. We are currently model only one forest type, which is Sitka spruce, commonly planted needle-leaf forest type in the UK. But we will extend the model for other common planted types, starting from calibration of parameters in our forest research sites. And the model could further be used to evaluate the potential carbon accumulation under other climate scenarios. If the situation gets worse, we can model the potential carbon impact on RCP 4.5 or 8.5, etc. Yeah, this is today's presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Let's take one question. If anybody has a question.
Yes.
Go with the second.
Hi, thank you for the presentation, from UCL. Thank you. So I just wondered, I see that, you're planning to model other common plantation types. Yeah. Are you also going to model how to improve biodiversity within the GGR areas? Because if you have huge areas of plantation of just one or two types of trees, it might not have good outcomes for biodiversity as well?
Yes, theoretically, we can put two or more different forest types in our modeling. But in our model, we have a very high resolution at 1 kilometer square. So setting single species in one grid is reasonable for our model, because if you plant two types of forests in a very near places, you can treat it as two different models in our model. Yeah, but theoretically we have put two or more different tree plantations in one simulation, and it could also work. But because due to the interaction between two trees, there's more room for us needs to be considered. So haven't fully operated it yet.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So Sarah Jones from Lancaster University will give the next presentation on the impact of regional autonomy over land use planning on AFOLU, net zero and biodiversity targets in the UK. Over to you.
Great. Can everyone hear me okay? Just sure. Yeah, so good morning. I'm Sarah and I'm a PhD student at Lancaster University and I'm part of the Data Science of the Natural Environment project. And so today I'm going to be talking about a piece of work that I've done for my PhD on the impact of regional autonomy on land use planning for net zero and biodiversity targets. So it is quite a small slot, so I'm just trying to cover as many of the results as possible. So I'm going to give a quick introduction to the work, talk about the FABLE approach, which is the model we use to quantify the pathways that I'm going to be talking about, the different pathway developments, some high-level results, and then some key messages and next steps. And if there's time, I have got some further results in the appendix, but just depending whether I get to that or not. So the agricultural, forestry and other land use sector accounted for 12% of UK greenhouse gas emissions in the UK in 2018. Agriculture is the main source of agriculture in the UK is the main source of both nitrous oxides and methane emissions. To achieve net zero, the UK net emissions must fall by 10%, or 100%, sorry, from current levels, with residual emissions offset by carbon removal. There are many opportunities for land use change to sequester carbon to aid achieving net zero, with many national governments incorporating nature-based solutions in land use and agriculture to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Regional autonomy of the devolved nations of the UK, combined with their different land capabilities, suggests that each has a different capacity to deliver on the AFOLU net zero targets, and the separate legislators and the executives in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland each have their own unique devolution settlement, so they each have their own capacity over certain aspects of the land use and agricultural sectors. So this paper investigated the differences in the ability of the UK to meet its international net zero commitments through developing pathways for the devolved nations for land use up to 2050. So they were quantified using a set of linked regional integrated land use models based on the FABLE calculator. So the FABLE calculator was designed by and developed by the Food, Agriculture, Biodiversity, Land Use and Energy Consortium. And this is a global network of national research organisations developing national-scale food and land use strategies aligned with different global goals, such as the Paris Agreement and the Kunming-Montreal Agreement for Biodiversity. Its integrated analysis aimed to help different country teams improve coherence and raise the level of ambition of national policies related to land use and food systems. And it is built on extensive stakeholder engagement. And so this participatory approach facilitates close links to current and future policy during the development of the assumptions underlying the pathways. So I've just left a screenshot of the website for more information on the consortium itself. And the map shows the countries that are also involved in the consortium. So it's quite small, but the UK does have a team, which is led by colleagues at UKCEH and the University of Oxford. So the calculator itself is an open source Excel-based tool used to study the potential evolution of food and land use change between 2000 and 2050. It has over 80 products in the calculator, so livestock, crops, vegetable oil, sugar, things like that. And it produces results for every 5-year time steps, and it is demand-driven. So the input parameters of interest are population, diet, food waste, biofuel demands, imports and exports, crop productivity, livestock productivity, density, and expansion of land use classes such as urban and forest areas, as well as protected areas. So then the model takes those inputs and calculates the food and biofuel demand, the cropland and pasture area required to then meet this demand, and then there is a land adjustment step. So it calculates the cropland and pasture area that is actually available within the UK or within the country. And the outputs of interest are land use change, greenhouse gas emissions, the land available for biodiversity conservation, and food security. And so it is the two land-related outputs that I'm going to be presenting the results on today. So as I mentioned, there is a UK Fable team involved in the consortium, and the model has been applied to the UK context. So the paper on the right is the UK's last iteration in the global consortium, and then the other paper formed part of my PhD, which was in collaboration with the Welsh Government, where we looked specifically at Wales and developed a calculator for them. So this is just an indication of the previous outputs that have been produced using the calculator itself. So moving on to this piece of work, 3 pathways were developed for each of the devolved nations. So we had a current trends pathway, which is a continuation with no current changes to policy. We then developed a pathway for each of the nations, which follows the UKCCC's recommended balance pathway. So this is a transformation of land to sequester carbon and restore peatlands, combined with increases in productivity through sustainable intensification. And then we developed a pathway for each of the devolved nations based on their own individual policy aspirations. So the Wales ones were taken from the previous bit of work we did with the Welsh Government, and they use land management techniques to deliver biodiversity, carbon restoration and production simultaneously on the same land. Scotland have a more ambitious targets for achieving net zero by 2045 and have a focus on multifunctional landscapes and a more holistic approach. Northern Ireland, given the infancy of climate policy there, it's very similar to current trends, but they do have higher aspirations for increases in afforestation. And the England pathway has aspirations to increase areas of land for biodiversity without compromising productivity. So this slide is just an indication of the sort of policy documents that were reviewed during this process. So things like the land use strategies in Scotland, their forest strategies. We used some housing growth indicators to see what urban areas are predicted to be in 2050, as well as peatland and forest action plans. So I'm going to, in the interest of time, as I said, I'm only going to talk about a couple of the key results. However, this slide is showing the proportion of the land use in 2050 for each of the pathways in comparison to 2000. So this is to help sort of visualize what the land use will look like whilst I'm talking about the next results. So as you can see, I don't know the sort of for each country and each pathway, we've got the proportion of land use. So it's really clear here to see the differences in the assumptions of the pathways. So for example, the CCC pathways, we see a reduction of extensive grassland and an increase in this other natural land, which is peat and boglands, bog and wetlands. And that's represented by the large blue bars there. The first sort of results of interest for achieving net zero is the land becoming a carbon sink. So the UKCCC state that for their recommended pathway, the AFOLU sector doesn't need to reach net zero, but the land must become a carbon sink. So as we can see here, do note the scales are slightly different, just given the sizes of the countries, but the important thing is the comparison between the pathways within each country. So you can see the top line is the current trend, so if we made no changes to policy, unsurprisingly, cumulative emissions from land use change remain quite high. But you can see for all countries, the other pathways, the land does become a carbon sink from sort of 2035, 2040 onwards. And so for the Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, the CCC pathway becomes cumulative sequesters more carbon than the devolved administration pathway, but for England it is the other way around. The second sort of key result of interest for this piece of work is to look at biodiversity indicators, and one in the Fable calculator is the land to support biodiversity conservation. So this is a user-defined proportion of forest area, extensive semi-natural grassland, under the assumption that it's managed for biodiversity, and other natural land. So as you can see across the pathways, the devolved administration pathway creates more land for biodiversity, and this is this end column here, and it's also made up of large proportions of extensive grassland. It also shows that changes in policy can have quite a large impact on biodiversity. So if you compare the current trends for England in 2050 on the far side And then the two other pathways, you can see a large increase in the land available due to the changes in the policies. So looking at the sort of autonomy, one of the positives of doing the sort of integrated regional models is that we can aggregate these. And if we focus on prioritising climate targets, so the greatest cumulative greenhouse gas emissions, and combine them, we end up getting a greater carbon sink for the UK if we do the CCC pathways for Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, but the devolved administration pathway for England. And for the total sector, this is also cumulatively less emissions over the time period, only slightly just though. And you can see the differences between the UK current trends and the other pathways, as well as the contribution of each of the countries in this graph. So you can see that England in the yellow creates the largest carbon sink out of all the countries. And if we do that same aggregation again for biodiversity, we see that whilst it does achieve more land for biodiversity, or simulate more land for biodiversity than the CCC pathways, it is still less than the DA pathways. So there's perhaps an indication here that there's different priorities have different results. So if you focus on biodiversity, you might see lesser gains in the greenhouse gas emission sequestration. So I'm just going to give some key messages and next steps. So the current trends pathway, as I've just showed, lead to a significant shortfall in achieving both the net zero and biodiversity targets. The DA pathways are more beneficial for biodiversity than the CCC pathways. They create more land for conservation, and they also increase protected areas as well. The CCC pathways sequester more carbon and see greater emissions reductions in 2050 in the AFOLU sector. And the findings emphasise the importance of that choice in priorities between climate and biodiversity that policymakers may have at both the subnational and national level. And they also highlight the importance of this coordination and alignment between the emerging policy designs of the UK nations to allow for managing the trade-offs or potential synergies that might occur. And some next steps for me and my PhD is to look at spatialising the FABLE results, because currently they are all just aggregations of land use change. This is in order to test the actual feasibility of the pathways with further land constraints such as topography or land suitability. And the UK FABLE team is currently developing some new pathways for the 2023 global iteration. So this is where all of the country teams input their pathways, and there is a aggregation to see whether the global targets will be met. So that's currently happening at the moment. So if anyone wants to sort of discuss that further, then do let me know. We're also in that making some improvements to the calculator to allow to model sort of agroforestry in those sort of multifunctional landscapes more clearly. So if anyone would like to discuss that further, then do come let me know. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Let's take a quick question if anybody has one. Yes, there is one.
But that's
Let's get the
really
microphone.
interesting. I'll shout it.
Thank you.
Wondering, as you start bringing these things together, imagine these changing happening in lots of countries at once.
Yeah.
Are you thinking about the impacts that changes in one country might have on, say, agricultural production in other countries and those?
Yeah. Yeah, so the global aggregation includes a couple of things. So it includes a trade balance. So they sort of, the Secretariat team do a balance of all the countries, and then they might send your pathways back and say, oh, you won't meet your export target if you don't do X, Y, Z, or there might need to be a bit of a rebalancing there. And also there is currently discussion about whether, I think as Charles mentioned, should the UK be doing more, or are they just, if we start importing more, are we just offsetting our emissions elsewhere? So there is a bit of rebalancing in terms of emissions as well, that's done at the global level. So on the FABLE website, they have a live dashboard that you can sort of select a country or select a region and see whether they're meeting the sort of targets, and then you can look at it combined. So. And the Secretariat also model the rest of the world region. So I think there's 26 or 27 country teams involved. So they do model the rest of the world so that you can get the trade balance completely. So great. Thank you.
And the final speaker in this session is Lois Mansfield from Environmentals Limited. If you please come to the front. The talk is about valuing all capitals in the landscape, Little Asby Common in Cumbria. After that, at 11 o'clock, we will have a coffee break next door. So over to you.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Well, I can hear myself, actually. I've got a weird echo. Okay, my name's Lois Mansfield, and I run a small consultancy called Environmentals Limited, and I'm here to present on behalf of Friends of the Lake District. Here we go. Okay, so Friends of the Lake District, they're an independent charity. Some of you will recognise them as they're actually related to KIPRI, so they're the Cumbria representative for KIPRI in the north of England in the Cumbria area. They're a membership organisation with around 6,000 members, and they're dedicated to protecting and enhancing the landscapes of the Lake District and Cumbria, despite their name being Friends of the Lake District. They own 12 areas of land across Cumbria, including an area known as Little Asby Common, which I'll show you in a minute. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this presentation quickly is what do we set out to do, our case study site, a little bit on the theory behind what we were doing, our methodology, results, and some of the lessons that we've learnt. So Friends of the Lake District sought to understand better the multiple benefits and values of their organisation's land assets, and they acknowledge that natural capital accounting has found traction with government policy and within UK land management organisations. But the problem with natural capital accounting is it doesn't actually recognise or account for other types of capital in the landscape. So that was particularly what they were interested in understanding, is things like social capital, human capital, cultural capital, and so on. Natural capital accounting from the Friends of the Lake District stance is philosophically, they're actually opposed to the quantification and monetarisation of landscapes and their elements, but they recognise that in order to be part of the game, they actually have to accept that they have to follow this process, because it will allow them to understand more about the process itself of natural capital accounting and multiple capital accounting, and it will also help them to demonstrate the value of their landscapes beyond just the natural assets that their areas have. So this is the case study area that they were interested in. This is Little Asby Common. Quite frankly, it's in the middle of nowhere. It's located 5 miles east of Alton. For those of you that might know Cumbria, it's to the east of the M6 as you go up towards Carlisle. That's probably the closest you can get to it. It's a 464 hectare upland common, and it includes limestone heath, Sunbeg Tarn, which is a mild tarn, and they're incredibly rare in this country, and then a large amount of heather moorland mosaic with grassland of various types. And the particular emphasis in Little Asby Common is it contains 196 archaeological sites as well. So archaeologically, it's very, very rich. So you can see immediately that natural capital accounting doesn't really account for some of these things that the Friends of the Lake District are interested in. So what is multiple capitals? What are they? Well, basically, for those of you that are unfamiliar, capital is the point where resources and assets are invested to create new resources. So natural capital is the one thing that most people have heard of. However, there are lots of other different types of capital. Human capital, such as the knowledge we use in order to manage those natural capitals. Social capital, that's working together. Cultural capital basically can be divided into intangible and tangible assets. And then finally, there are financial assets and capitals, which again, people are more familiar with. And the idea is that those capitals and parts of those capitals interact with each other to create a landscape. And this is a nice aerial of Sunbeg Common to give you an idea of the sort of landscape that we're talking about. So this was based on some work that I did with a consortium of organisations that did some work for Natural England. And what we were trying to do is to understand how to create the multiple capitals framework. And that was really where the idea came from. But what we wanted to do with Friends of the Lake District, and they were very keen to understand, is, well, what else is of value in that landscape and how can we value it in a financial way? So what we do is we set up a multiple capitals account balance sheet, just like you do with a natural capitals account system. And we append monetary value to and create a financial account for all the capitals and all the various bits that make up the landscape. So the sorts of things we're interested in are the benefits, So that's the good things like carbon sequestration. But we're also interested in detractors as well, things that actually impact negatively on the landscape. So particularly for Little Asbig Common, lots of people park their camper vans up there overnight, and that is actually illegal, but it also is a detractor in relation to the landscape itself. One of the things that we don't include in here is a discounting rate. We didn't use that this time because we were actually just interested in a baseline to try and understand the methodology and how the methodology works, warts and all. So it's a very straightforward system of accounting. The problems come when you start to break it all down, and I'll explain that in a minute. So the methodology, we derived all the data that we needed, either from field surveys, from public surveys. So we did a massive online survey, and we got about 250 responses from not only the membership, but people outside the membership as well. We carried out workshops with the local community to get their views about how they valued things. And then we gathered a vast range of secondary published data, including things like archaeological surveys and vegetation surveys. So what you then do is you break down your landscape into its landscape attributes. So each capital has a number of components to it, which I call dimensions. So for natural capital, for instance, we were looking at ecosystems, freshwater and geodiversity. So the landscape attributes can then be dropped down again from that. For instance, with ecosystem services, we're looking at upland moor and mosaic. For human capital, knowledge and skills, so we're trying to understand how people manage this landscape. And as it's a common, it has some unique management systems which you don't find in lowland landscapes known as commoning. It has a system where you gather livestock from a heft, which is an area of land that doesn't have a boundary to it, but the stock know which bits of land they belong to. We're thinking about dry stone walling, the skills that are involved. We looked at the social capital, both the bonding and the bridging networks. So that was we're interested in the Commoners Association and what they bring to the party and how they organise themselves, and also partnership organisations such as the Westmoreland Dales Heritage Lottery Fund project, and also Natural England and Friends of the Lake District, and how they donate to the system. And then the cultural stuff, we're interested in the tangible and the intangible assets of the cultural landscape. So it's basically chopping up into small pieces and then trying to value each of the small pieces. And then obviously at the end, we've got the financial stuff, which involves the Agri-Environment Scheme grants that the farmers get currently, the commoners get, the HLF programme, the Heritage Lottery money, and then also local business multiplier effects, so the money that's coming into the local economy because people are using the common or staying there or living there, and so on and so forth. So the way the system works is that you identify a number of quantification tools, you inventory each of the different attributes within each of the capitals, you work out how much there is, you quantify them, you qualify them, and then you decide how you're going to evaluate them. The next step is it's sort of an interrelated relationship, is once you've worked out what you want to quantify, you then need to find a methodology to quantify it. And this is what takes the time and the voluminous amount of hours. Obviously, some of these things, such as grant values, there is a direct market value, so that's quite easy to work out. You can also use what are known as benefits transfer, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, where you take figures derived from previous studies and you apply them to this context. But there are lots of flaws with doing that because most people believe that benefits transfer is a one-shot activity which occurs on that location at the time. So it's difficult to take those results and apply them to another context. And then the final thing we did is, if we couldn't find a tool, and believe you me, I trawled thousands of databases and looked for loads and loads of different ways to account for all these various attributes, is we plug the gaps using willingness to pay as a methodology, as a technique. And again, we recognise the flaws of willingness to pay, although the Green Book from HMRC does actually recognise it. So we tried to play by the rules as much as possible because we were trying to test this methodology to try and get an answer about how much the common was worth. And from that, we derived 3 accounts, A, B and C. I don't need to read those out, but the idea is that we tried to use willingness to pay as little as possible in relation to account C. Somewhere in the middle was trying to use maximum benefits transfer, and then account A was all willingness to pay. So we asked some questions of the population of people that we sampled, as well as having the techniques available, which we took off the shelf, because we were interested in comparison to see how much the figures varied. I'm not going to show you all the results from all the 5 areas. I've just picked a few to give you an idea of the sorts of things we came up with. So for those of you that are interested, I know in natural capital accounting, these are the sorts of figures that we derived in relation to the natural capital and how we attributed it down. That's a mix of benefits transfer methods and also willingness to pay in there. And then we've got detractors. And for those of you that are interested, the detractor for the ecosystem is because one of the SSSI units on Little Asby Common isn't in favourable condition. And favourable condition is the JNCC target that you're set. So it hasn't reached its status of what we expect to see for that particular type of habitat. So it's actually a detractor, and so you actually have to take money off your balance sheet. So that gives you an idea that the natural capital for the common was worth about 1.5 million with its detractor. The other one that people are very interested in at the moment, I know there's a very large project going on to look at how do you value cultural capital, which is being driven by DCMS. Again, what we did here, a lot of these are willingness to pay methodologies because there aren't any methodologies. So we were just trying to use willingness to pay to try and plug the gaps, understand what people wanted. So it's things like recreation and sport, which is often classified under natural capital. And this is one of the issues that we came across, is that there's been quite a lot of appropriation by natural capital of sucking in other capital benefits into its own sphere or genre, or whatever you would like to call it. So we tried to reallocate things back to where they should naturally belong based on the literature and the research that's been done. So you can see with the cultural capital, there's a big chunk on landscape aesthetics. That's really hard to value, so we had to use willingness to pay. So we asked people, how much would you pay in order to perpetuate a hectare of this particular landscape? And the same again with heritage. We asked them about the archaeological sites on the common and finds and artefacts and so on and so forth. And there was only one detractor there, and that was due to horse riding, which is not allowed on the common as well. So the total account at the end of the day, as I say, I only looked at a few to give you an idea of the sorts of figures. This was the account in the middle that we came to. So you can see, I think the interesting thing is how much people valued cultural capital over natural capital. And I think that makes people quite nervous. But actually what it's telling us is a lot of the cultural capital is in a relationship, an interrelationship with natural capital, and the two work in synergy because it's a socio-ecological landscape, as we know most places are in upland areas in this country. So the total financial benefit for Little Asby Common for 2022-23, the range of figures that we had from about 20 million to 61 million. And that for Friends of the Lake District was actually really useful. Not the figures themselves, but the relative importance of how their membership and the visitors and the community, the local community, were valuing the common itself and the different aspects of the common. And there's a general breakdown of the figures for those of you that are interested in a bit more detail to see the sorts of things. And you can see that basically cultural capital was the most important thing. And that's interesting in itself about how we relate as individuals to landscapes and how we visit rural areas and live in rural areas and so on and so forth. And then finally, the sorts of lessons that we learnt from it, because obviously we think this is the first time this has been done in this country for a landscape. We know that Yorkshire Water have done some work in relation to their business, which accounts for different aspects of landscape. But we think this is the first time it's actually been done for what I call a protected landscape or a rural landscape or whatever you would like to call it. We think it's the first time. So we were really dipping our toe in the water to try and understand where the issues were. So engaging with the public is obviously the biggest thing. They do struggle with the concept of willingness to pay, and we had to spend quite a lot of time explaining it to them. A lot of people wrote in and complained, why are you asking us to value the common? Are you going to concrete it over, or are you going to sell it? Are you trying to work out how much it's worth? So there was a lot of negotiation and understanding and facilitation with the local community and with the membership to explain to them that we weren't trying to flog it off. We were just trying to understand its values. We know that willingness to pay as a technique has lots and lots of inherent flaws, but as I say, it's accepted by the HMRC's Green Book. So it's a tried and tested method that's accepted in the broader policy context. We did try different techniques with the same values to see what happens. So, for example, we did a benefits transfer with habitats. We also did a willingness to pay. And it's interesting to see the difference in factor in relation to how the public perceive habitats in relation to a more sort of objective method created through a different methodology. Our biggest issue was capital appropriation, which goes on, which is where natural capital has scooped in all the extra stuff and saying, oh, hey, look, this is what we create, whereas what we try to do is reapportion it back out where it belonged into other capital areas. Double accounting is something that always people jump up and down about. Lots of people kept telling me you need to be careful about double accounting, so we took a long time to try and split things out so you don't account for the same attribute twice and financially value it twice and therefore wreck the accounting system. We learnt that probably relative values are more important than actual values because obviously willingness to pay, yes, you can argue how long is a piece of string sometimes, and we all value things differently. Everybody in this room would come up with a different willingness to pay for St James's Park because we all see it in a different way. And then finally, the other lesson we learned is that data acquisition, processing and manipulation takes a very long time indeed. And when you're a small independent charity trying to understand your own landscapes, that's where it comes into being. But having run the process, we now know an awful lot more about it. And therefore we have a much slicker system, and we're interested in talking to other organisations that would like to run this model to test it out again in different scales, different sizes, catchments, other areas, to see whether we can actually begin to actually focus it a bit and try and get some results that make some sense. So that's it. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me.
Saw you first, Emma. Just because you were in my line of sight, sorry.
Hi, thank you, that was great. What struck me there from your talk is that the top thing was cultural, and then the environment, and then finances at the bottom. And the fact that the cultural was coming out so high, and it was so, and money, basically, we were so unsuitable for capturing its value. So it strikes me that when it comes to landscapes, economics and money is clearly not the right value system to use to make decisions about them. So my question was just kind of, are you going to publish this somehow? Because it seems a great demonstration of that.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, we are. There's a report coming out next week. So there's a nice glossy with lots of information for people. We just couldn't get it out in time for this conference, which is a big shame. But I've got some information with me about Friends of the Lake District if anybody wants anything. But it will be on their website. So again, we're really keen to push this idea. We just want to try it out. We know it's not appropriate in some instances, but unless you try, you've got no baseline to work from and no critique to work from.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you.
I realise there are more raised hands of people who want to ask questions, so please take the coffee break as an opportunity to catch up with the presenters and ask more questions about the talks this morning. I would just like to thank all the presenters of the morning session one more time for the talks. Thank you.